Welcome to the More to Story podcast. I'm so glad that you have come along. My name's Andy Miller, and I'm the president at Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. We have our largest student body ever this fall with more than 600 students at WBS. It's kind of a funny moment for us because I just had a great time last weekend at our alumni reunion, and I sent an email to all of our alumni. We have 580 alumni, but we have 660 students right now. So we have more current students than we have alumni. We're so thankful for our alumni and the kind of the foundations that we have at WBS, but we'd love for you to find out more about us at wbs.edu. We have bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. We have a lay initiative that's starting right in this fall season called the Wesley Institute. We'd love for you to check that out. Also, I'm thankful for opportunities to engage many of you online. If you would go to andymillerthird.com, that's andymillerii.com. If you sign up for my email list, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And with that comes like a 45-minute teaching session and then an 8-page PDF that you can use as you're preparing to teach or preach. And it gives you some, it's a kind of a summary of the inductive Bible study method with some creative prompts for you to be able to use in that process. So I'd love for you to find out about that. I also have some courses that are available there, a course on the afterlife called Heaven and Other Destinations, and then a course on the book of Jude, 6 sessions. So if you're looking for a study this fall, or if you're looking for something for a small group or a Sunday school class, go to my website and click on courses, and you can find those there. There's interactive discussion boards. There are discussion guides and then a video teaching that's available there. So I'd love to share that with you. So you can find out about that at andymillerthird.com. All right. I am so glad to welcome into the podcast my new friend, Ben Shaw, Dr. Ben Shaw, who is the president of Core Ministries. Is that what Core Ministries, Ben? Is that the right thing?
Core Apologetics.
Core Apologetics. CORE. Now, Ben, there are some people in my audience who come from the tradition of the Salvation Army, and they call their churches Core, CORPS. But this is CORE, right?
Yes, yes.
Tell us about that. What is Core?
Yes, Core Apologetics. So we actually started off initially as a doubters ministry. Ron Davis was the founder of Core Apologetics, and it actually came about as I started working with Dr. Gary Habermas on his magnum opus that he's been working on for like the past decade or so.
Okay.
And Dr. Habermas used to talk to a lot of doubters. And when we started working on the magnum opus, he was like, hey, I can't talk to all these doubters and do the magnum opus at the same time. Can you guys help? And he's talking to his PhD students. Can you guys help me talk to some doubters? And Ron put his hand up. He's like, yep, I want to do that because I want to do my dissertation on doubt. And so he's talked well over 1,000 doubters since then. And he started Core as just a project where he'd be talking with doubters, helping people with doubts. And last year, he started talking to me. He goes, hey, Ben, if you jump on with us and join with me, we might be able to do a lot more than just dealing with doubt. Maybe we can do a lot more as far as help building up apologetics, giving some of the core truths of Christianity. And I was praying at the time, trying to figure out where God was leading me. And I was like, Ron, this sounds like a great idea. Let's do that. So we relaunched Core Apologetics in October, November of last year.
Okay.
And so what we're trying to do with it is we're trying to help churches and organizations use apologetics to help build and equip disciples, but also minister to those who are doubting. And so for me, part of this, what's good is he's got a passion for dealing with doubt. I was actually on his dissertation committee on his dissertation on doubt. Yeah. So we were talking all the time about it, about these sorts of things. And part of my story, I'm sure it'll be relevant later too, but I got saved at a young age, but I really didn't get discipled.
Okay.
Until I went to Liberty. So college. And I went to a couple Christian schools, a couple public schools too. So God had some oases along the way, but I really wasn't discipled. I didn't even know Paul wrote many of the New Testament books.
Wow. Interesting.
Honestly. Yeah. And then I learned that at Liberty. I'm like, oh my goodness. And I tried reading the Bible by myself a bunch of times. Couldn't do that. And so, but as I went to Liberty, I found out, you can ask questions and they want to talk about these things. They've studied these things. They've thought about these things. Let me keep asking questions. And so I've always understood disciples can have questions and they're not doubts. Sometimes disciples have doubts, like John the Baptist does in Matthew 11, for example. But if you're going to give a reason for the hope that you have, the apologetics, Peter verse, we have to know the hope that we have. And as we
Yes.
learn and grow to know that hope, we're going to ask questions. And so
Yeah.
that's what I was doing. And I was just asking questions about that. And if you love and want to read scripture, you're going to ask questions about scripture. And so those were some of the things we did. So long story short, studying with Habermas, both Ron and I studied with Habermas. The resurrection is pretty fundamental to core apologetics. So one of our priorities is to help get the work he's done out of the seminary into churches, into organizations, so we can have the leaders at churches, new believers, growing believers, mature believers, having a deep understanding of the evidence for the resurrection, because that's the cornerstone. That's of first importance, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15.
Yes.
So how can we equip them that way? No matter your emotions, no matter your circumstances, it's a reality you have to address and think about when you're acting and what you're doing. So that's a
Yes.
fundamental important part. We also stress reliability of the New Testament, as you can imagine, and dealing with doubt. And we do some worldview and discipleship, but we're trying to help build disciples so that they can go and then build disciples. So that's one of our goals. It's not Ben apologetics. It's not Ron apologetics. It's core apologetics. We want to help people major
Amen.
on the majors, because there's a lot of debates on things where we don't even have the fundamentals right. Let's start getting there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. We didn't talk
I don't
about this
think.
earlier, but I do jujitsu, and this is an
Okay.
analogy I use a lot. If you're just starting at jujitsu, you don't jump in by learning a flying, triangle choke or something like that. You got to learn the basics. You got to understand the fundamentals before you can start getting into the crazy stuff. And it's like that with everything. And so we're trying to help people actually return back to those majors, majoring on those things, understanding the resurrection, reading scripture, knowing scripture, and then that should have an effect in your life, how you live that out. With your family, with your kids, all those sorts of things, with your finances, with your job. So
Yeah,
those
this
are
is
some
really
of the things we're
helpful.
aiming for.
I think one of the things that with these core foundational pieces in apologetics is that you can't overstate them enough. You're so familiar with it. And to a certain degree, I am too, though I haven't done an apologetics degree. And we might think, I get every now and then when I would, even bring these basic ideas and minimal facts up in and we'll talk about that later in a sermon. I think, oh well, they've already heard this. Or no, I think leaders, people who are trying to help serve other people, this is one of these things that's necessarily over communicated. Let people come to you and say, I got it already. Please tell me, stop it. In that case, you probably need to keep going. So I think that was appealing to me when I saw your book, which we'll talk about here in a little bit too, Trustworthy, this new IVP book. Just so you know, folks, that's a main thing we'll get to today, but I have too many questions after Ben's first thing that I want to follow up on. But it's 13 arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. This was published by IVP. It's just come out here in 2024. So we want to walk through a few of those arguments. But there's a couple of things that you've already indicated I think are helpful for us. And you've said Gary Habermas's name. And some of my audience will be like, oh man, this guy studied with Habermas. This is kind of a key thinker for our time, and he's written a foreword for your book, and he has established several things that are at the foundation of what you're doing. But you have, beyond an academic relationship with him, being in the same school, now kind of serving as a peer to a certain degree, you have a deeper relationship that I think many people would find interesting. Tell us about that, how you got to know Gary.
Yeah, that's funny. One part I didn't mention, the main reason I went to Liberty in the first place was because they had a hockey team. That was the only reason I went. I heard about Liberty.
I didn't know they had hockey until you told me. I didn't realize this. So
they have an amazing ice rink on their campus, and it's gotten even better since I came. So now they have a jumbotron. It's all on campus too. So it's amazing. They didn't have a jumbotron when I was there, and I thought it was amazing. So I went there just for that reason. Gorgeous.
And you're from South Florida too, by the way, right? You're from South Florida.
Yeah.
And now people don't know this about Florida. I was my last appointment in the Salvation Army was the area commander for the Salvation Army in Tampa, and the most popular team there of all, even when Tom Brady was there with the Bucks, was the Tampa Bay Lightning. People do not realize that hockey is big in Florida. But
we have a lot of guys from Canada who retire, and where they go? They're going to Florida. They know a good thing when they see it. Plus, there's tax benefits for those players down there. Anyway, that's a different topic. But I started playing really late. I started playing when I was about 15 years old,
Oh,
which is
interesting.
very late. But I was pretty miserable because I wasn't discipled and I was struggling with.
Yeah,
I was,
yeah.
there's a great song from the '90s that says, "How are you going to stand if you don't understand?" And so I was not understanding, so I was not standing. I was tossed here and there by every wind of South Florida doctrine, um, postmodernism, and things like that. And so, but I did think, okay, if I play hockey, I might be able to meet a girl. That might work out. That's kind of my best bet right now. And so I started playing hockey. I played every single day. I lived in Connecticut I actually moved to Connecticut for a few years to play before going to Liberty. And then when I went to Liberty, I met my wife, by the way, at Liberty through the hockey team. So that all worked
Very
out.
good.
That
Glad that
plan
worked
took a
out.
long time to execute, but it worked. But I met this guy. So one of the goalie from the hockey team, he was taking me through the halls one day, and he's like, "Hey, I just want to introduce you. This is the former hockey coach, Gary Habermas." I was like, "Oh, that's cool. That's
Amazing.
a former hockey coach." We're the new guys. You're old school. I'm sure you were good, but you're not as good as we are. We are, the cream of the crop here. And then we met him a couple other times. And then in my senior year, I took a class called Christian Evidences. And we read this book, The Case for the Resurrection. I was like, this is the hockey coach. What's he doing? And then I found out he's the world's leading expert on the resurrection. And then so I was like, oh, that's really neat. And then over the years after that, I started to follow up with him and talked about the resurrection. And we just he had an opening for me to be a research assistant. So then I got to study the resurrection and get my degree for free. And I'm like, this is awesome. It's a great
Yeah,
setup.
yeah.
So I was able to do that. And so we did that.
And for somebody who doesn't know who we're talking about, you said the world's leading authority on the resurrection. But if you could summarize, if you're like an elevator with somebody and they ask, so who is that? What's his significance? And what is it that he's done?
Yeah, he's probably forgotten more about the resurrection than you and I both know together.
Right, right.
But so yeah, he's been studying the resurrection since 1970. That's probably a conservative number. So, well over 50 years. And he's debated a number of prominent atheists, especially Anthony Flew, who some of you guys may know from the mid 90s, late 90s as well. Anthony Flew ended up becoming a theist later on. But Habermas also has had a number of debates on Jesus' resurrection. He's developed what's called the minimal fact approach, which is the most used approach for defending, discussing, or demonstrating Jesus' resurrection. And it's very simple. A hockey guy like me could get it. That's why I think I liked it so much.
Yeah.
And it involves using well-evidenced historical facts that are widely accepted by virtually all scholars. And it doesn't matter their background. If they think the Bible's inerrant and inspired, if they think it's unreliable and filled with errors, they still believe these facts because of that first criterion that I just mentioned, that's highly evidenced. And
Gotcha.
so the facts are ones we probably all know. Jesus died by crucifixion.
Right.
That his disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus, that Paul converted, that James converted, that the disciples were transformed and were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. So those are things that we all tend to know, but understanding that, yes, we know them, but they're actually very well evidenced historically, so much so that virtually all scholars grant these historical events. Now, what's really interesting about them is those few facts right there make it very difficult for the major alternative theories to explain away Jesus's resurrection. So
okay, let's get into
what
that. Now that's your 13th point in this book,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And it's interesting that that's the last one. Nevertheless, like you smiled there. So is there something behind that? Why you made that
there's
laugh?
a reason. Okay. There's a reason why. Because if my first 12 arguments are terrible and I'm wrong, completely wrong on them, we still have Jesus's resurrection. So
Right.
like I just mentioned a moment ago, even if the Bible, the New Testament is unreliable, we still have these minimal facts, which are highly evidenced and widely agreed upon, even by people who think it is unreliable. We still have Jesus's resurrection. And so we still have the centerpiece of Christianity.
I mean, probably one of the first level that people come to when they hear these type of arguments, so they see somebody who went to a seminary or is a Christian philosopher, whatever, or Christian historian, they're going to say, but you're basing everything on your text, right? Of course, your book tells you these things, but you've said it multiple times. But I don't think we can overstate this, that you're saying all scholar, or almost all scholar, or is it all scholar? I mean, some people
We
deny
always say virtually
Jesus
all because there's
virtually. Yeah,
always, yeah, virtually all scholars. We always say virtually all scholars because someone could come out tomorrow and publish something that's just out there. And we see in academia now, people can publish all sorts of things. So
yeah,
we just say virtually all scholars because, and again, it's the evidence for it. We're definitely not saying it's true because everyone says it's true. We're saying, hey, there are these multiple lines of evidence. And these multiple lines of evidence have convinced a wide variety of scholars. I actually have a book on my shelf back there that just focuses on Jewish scholarship on Jesus's resurrection, and they
okay.
go through these minimal facts as well. And so it's a great book by Dr. Mishkin is his name, and so recommend that one as well. But in any event, that's what the minimal facts is able to do: present these facts, and it unpacks them historically using just everyday normal historical methods.
Give them to us again. One, two, three.
Jesus' death by crucifixion.
Yeah,
The disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus, that the disciples were transformed as a result of those experiences so that they were willing to suffer and die. We could also, I didn't mention this earlier, but it's proclaimed very early. 1
yeah,
Corinthians 15, most scholars attribute to being dated to the early 30s, the creedal information there. The conversion of James, who was Jesus's brother, but was skeptical during Jesus's life. He became the leader of the early church, and we have first century evidence that he died and was martyred. And then the conversion of Paul, who was also not just a skeptic, but a persecutor of the early church. And then we
yeah.
also have first century evidence too for his martyrdom.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm getting this because we said one and two, and
Yep.
getting between two and three.
I added
So
another one. Jesus'
okay,
death is number one. Yeah,
okay, Jesus' death.
death. Because there's different, you can use different lists depending upon your audience and how skeptical they are. That's why
Right.
there's some flexibility there. Jesus' death, the
Yeah.
experiences of the disciples.
Yep.
You have that these experiences are preached or reported very early. That's that 30s AD comment. The disciples were transformed as a result of these experiences, such that they were willing to
That's
suffer and die.
four. That's four. Yeah,
Yep, that
yeah,
gets us
yeah, yeah.
four.
Okay.
5 is the conversion of James, and then 6 is the conversion of Paul.
Great. Now, I've done some work on Jude. Do you think Jude is also kind of like in that same period of coming along with James?
Yeah, so what's interesting about James compared to Jude is that James is specifically mentioned in the creedal in that creedal
Yeah, sure.
section of 1 Corinthians 15, so he definitely gets more attention. And James was also the leader of the early church. And James is also mentioned in Galatians 1:19, where Paul goes 3 years after his conversion. He meets with Peter in 18, and then he says, I also saw James. He doesn't mention Jude. There's a little bit of at least focus
Yeah.
going on with James there.
So I did a first person monologue of Jude, and I just go ahead and suggest that the brothers of Jesus, based on some
Yeah.
other New Testament data, didn't believe in him as indicated, so that Jude's in the same camp. But I think there's something too about just acknowledging these basic facts, and then that then is the foundation. Like, you don't start with what are the wrong starting points, Ben? Like, where do sometimes we go when we're talking to people who have doubts? We end up making an argument, maybe about something in the life of the church, maybe about a view of the authority of Scripture. Where are some of those wrong starting points?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that may depend on the context.
Yeah,
One of the reasons why I like the minimal facts approach is it keeps the main thing the main thing. It keeps us focusing on the majors. Now, so there's a section in the book on dating, and dating is a great topic. It's an important topic. But if we want
yeah,
to talk about the gospel, for example, do we want to debate whether Mark was written in 40 AD or 65
right.
AD? Those are good. They're interesting, especially for, academic guys. We like talking about that stuff.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
when we're talking about the gospel, I want to stay on the gospel. So I think that's
yeah,
one area of value of the minimal facts approach. Another is that if I'm struggling with factual questions, I need to have some factual answers. So if I'm told, for example, like, hey, how do we know, that James, we just mentioned James and Jude were skeptics. How do we know that? And just trust that Jesus is always going to be with you and his presence.
yeah,
But if I'm doubting the resurrection, I don't think his presence is with me. I'm asking a factual question and trying to
right,
address
right.
my emotions. You're kind of getting the wires crossed there. So we want to do, and vice versa. If I have an emotional doubt, I don't want a factual answer is not going to be able to tackle it the same way. So
Right,
those
right.
are
Good
two
point.
kind of models there where you can kind of go the wrong way. Another is just forgetting to give reasons, like just unpacking
Mm,
some of the reasons. Like the crucifixion itself is very embarrassing.
mm.
That was the punishment of slaves. We take it for granted today, but back then, Paul says it was foolishness to the Gentiles and a stumbling block to the Jews. He's like, everyone I'm talking to like thinks it's ridiculous, and
Yeah, yeah.
so it was a serious issue back then. So those are helpful, and that's intuitive. I think as we start unpacking, yeah, that is embarrassing back then. Like we don't just volunteer these embarrassing things, or if we're going to make something up, we're going to make the best story in the world, not where he was getting hit and flogged and crucified.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned earlier talking about the dating, the early dating as being significant, and you have a chapter that works through the creedal traditions, and I find that this to be something that there seems to be a block for people getting the reality of New Testament material being creedal or hymn like hymns that are in the New Testament. It just doesn't always connect with folks. But why? People know the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, these type of things. But why? How can we get to understand the evidence that comes within the New Testament itself of these creedal traditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's exactly right. When we hear creed, we immediately think like Nicene Creed or something like that. That's,
Yeah, yeah.
300 years later. These creeds are actually, the creeds in the New Testament are oral traditions that are preserved in writing. They didn't have quotation marks and footnotes back then, but they would identify, or there are ways in which we can identify these early oral traditions that are preserved in a text. So even though the text like 1 Corinthians may be written around 55 AD, the oral tradition that's preserved in the text dates back to the early 30s. And I go, okay, well, how do you know that? What are you talking about? Well, 1 Corinthians 15 has one of the best and most easily identifiable creeds in the New Testament. Now,
Okay.
most of the time, if you can read Greek, that helps. And actually, what you'll find in some Bibles now, like the HCSB, I believe, and some others, they'll bracket out what they believe to be a creed or a hymn.
Yeah.
But in 1 Corinthians 15, it's very explicit because Paul says, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. And so the words delivered and received are two technical words that a rabbi would use for formally handing off tradition.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
it's kind of like it would be like a form of catechesis back then. This is what I need to make sure you guys understand because this is what we're preaching and teaching. And in an oral culture, you need to make it memorable or have different cadences to it. And we have many songs like that today, like especially children's songs and things like that, because we can memorize them. We probably know them even now, decades later.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
very similar back then. But Paul says, "I delivered to you that which I received," and then he goes on. Again, this is of first importance. What's of first importance? It sounds an awful lot like the minimal facts that
Yes,
Jesus
indeed.
died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised again 3 days later according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12, and then he goes on to list a number of appearances. So we have, and then he goes on to talk about his own suffering, about, by the way, his own willingness to suffer with beasts in Ephesus, for example. But anyway, so here we see some language, and there's some cadence and some and that language. A late rather Jewish New Testament scholar, Pinchas Lapide, he notes 8 different reasons why that information, 1 Corinthians 15, is a creed. So scholars have a bunch of different ways, but the most easiest is just listen to Paul. He's telling you, I'm delivering to you what I also
Right. Right.
received. So remember when I gave this to you guys? And then he's, like you said a moment ago, we never want to stop reminding one another of these things. That's exactly what Paul's doing. Hey guys, don't forget what I told you. Remember this? This is what I gave you. But if Paul gave it to them when he first visited around 50 AD, well, when did Paul get it? And who did Paul get it from?
Right.
And
Right.
so Paul actually helps us in Galatians 1:18, like we just talked about. This is where scholars think that Paul not only got this tradition, but probably all the traditions we have, oral traditions that we have preserved. And so because he says 3 years after my conversion, I went to Jerusalem and met, hysteresai is the Greek word there, has to do with firsthand knowledge, getting to know very well Peter, one of the leading disciples, and James was also there, the leader of the Jerusalem church. So 2 really important guys. And then Paul says in Galatians 2, 14 years later, I went back again and
Right.
John was there. So Paul's getting this information confirmed at that early date. And again, scholars can date that depending on when you take Jesus's crucifixion and some other things. We just say early 30s. That's the bottom line we need to take away from there. But a lot of scholars take that information in 1 Corinthians 15 to not only be very early, but it's connected with eyewitnesses. So it's very powerful, very strong evidence for the resurrection. Now, the chapters on creeds, that's just the best one. But there's a number of creeds in the New Testament that scholars think. And creeds, there's a number of different words that scholars may use: confessions, kerygma, homologia, or same word. So there's a number of different oral traditions I think we've been using too. So you can use these different words, but and scholars kind of debate. There's anywhere from a dozen or two creeds in the New Testament to 50. So it just depends. And so there's some that are black and white, like the 1 Corinthians 15. There's some that are a little more fuzzy. But some other well-known ones, maybe like Romans 1:3-4, Romans 10:9. If you confess, that word confessing, right? Yes. So that's that element there. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. And then Philippians 2:5-11.
Yeah.
That you mentioned.
Colossians 1, the Christ hymn there. I think most translations now are indenting them in a way when you see that. And so I think that's just a clue. Like it's almost like, even if you look at I don't buy the argument completely, but I do take Pauline authorship of Ephesians, and often the reasons that people don't think that Paul wrote Ephesians is because that it has a different vocabulary, which I always think, well, why would that be just because? But nevertheless, that argument in itself never stood up to me. But then I saw Marcus Barth, Karl Barth's son, in his Anchor Bible commentary, which probably came out in the 70s or so. He sees the Ephesians almost as a liturgical document that is filled with creeds, dozens of them, just in these few chapters. And so in that Anchor Bible commentary, he indents more than I. It's hard to understand. Like, there'd be so much there, but he looks at it like as if you're opening it up, and people would have been joining in and understanding, reciting these things. And this is what's so important. Like, the nature of the different type of culture that the New Testament times were in. I think that's why would creed? I mean, it seems pretty obvious, Ben, but I just want you to go ahead and explicate it there. Why were creeds so important in this culture?
Yeah, there's a I believe I footnoted, the name's escaping me. I think it's Coleman. It's Coleman, Martin Hengel,
Oscar Kuhlman.
Or Oscar Coleman, who they give a nice breakdown of 4 or 5 different reasons why these creeds would have been invented. Preaching is one of them. Using it for polemics would be another. For encouragement of believers would be another. And if you're in the case of persecution, you need to be able to recall these things to your mind. Like Paul, when he's in jail, and in Philippians 4, he says, dwell on those things which are good and holy, and all those sorts of things. So there's a number of different reasons why they could be used and said. But also, I didn't mention this. I wanted to kind of steal the chapter or the title of the recent book that came out, 24 or so Arguments for God's Existence.
Okay,
yeah, it's just a good title for a number of different reasons. But there's more arguments than just the 13, and not even talking about the use of a secretary or something like that in the composition of a letter, and how that can affect the letter, the language used, and all those sorts of, and what freedom they had too, and all that sort of stuff as the letter was being written. So I think those are all important. But back to your point on they would receive letters, and we know that too, that Paul would be like, hey, expect them to get a letter and read it to the believers there. So there's those different elements. So if we don't always have, we're just spoiled today where we always have access to a source or a document or something.
Yeah, sure.
Where back then you have to remember it, or you don't have it, or you have to sit here and practice it and dwell on it, and that's going to help you remember it, because then you'll have it. So I always joke, like Habermas, I'm going to go to Habermas. We have this joke when we talk about, he's got a lockbox of a memory. He can recall things from his studies. He could tell you when Lapid, published his book, and probably with who he published it with.
Wow.
And my brain, my memory is like nothing. His memory is like to like what Michael Phelps is to water. His brain is to academia. Like, he's built for it. My brain, not like, but as I can type and find something on my computer almost as fast as he can remember it. So it's just a different, we're at a different, we've got more technology than when he was doing his dissertation on a typewriter. And so now, how much more so back then, when even just getting something written was costly, expensive,
Right,
and
right.
time consuming. So
And it's just not a literate culture. Like not as many people would have been, so many less people would have been able to read and write in that period too. You know, you bring up Habermas. I've never met him. I need to make sure to make that happen at some point. But I love hearing, like, folks, just Google him or YouTube him. And to me, his voice is so it does, you don't feel too intimidated. And I come from the Chicago area, and I think
oh
he
yeah.
is from that region as well. It just sounds like I don't know if he's a Bears fan, but I feel like I'm just pulling up with a Bears fan and somebody who's like having a Polish sausage and enjoy, like, I just love it. But yet you can hear that. And part of his work has been across these 40, 50 years of putting together all of these resources that come from a variety of traditions. And he's put together this database, right? That's just, is this a part of his, what this you said earlier, his magnum opus is like
Yeah, so
publishing that in some way?
his magnum opus is going to be 4 volumes when it's all done. The
Okay.
first volume has recently come out in January of this year, 2024, and it's just on the historical method and evidence, and it's only 1,000 pages. So just a couple, 1,054, no big
Only
deal.
1,000. Yeah.
That's it right there.
Oh, I
So
see it. Oh, there you go.
yeah,
Okay.
it's a big one. Volume 2 is coming out. It's just on alternative theories. That's coming out in less than a month. In September, it'll be out. And that's a little bit shorter. It's 900 pages. So, all on alternative theories. Volume 3 is going to be a scholarly spectrum of views. And that's going to be more like an index of where different scholars have commented on these different topics, from the facts to alternative theories. And then volume 4 will be practical, pastoral, and worldview issues. And so I know he's working on that one now. So that's the 4-volume set.
So they get to alternative theories, and I want to get back to your book in a second. But maybe some people, this is the first time they've heard about minimal facts, they've heard about Habermas or these ideas, and like trying to set that as a foundation for what we're doing. But when we say alternative theories, it's people taking these facts, and trying to come up with a way to explain their reality. And so ultimately, like, we're going back to 1 Corinthians 15 and saying that God raised Jesus from the dead, that's the best explanation of these facts. But others come in and then they find other, sometimes naturalistic ways to take these facts and explain them. So what are some of those alternative theories that people have developed? What are the kind of main ones?
Yeah. So just to pick a common one that people may all be familiar with. How do you know the disciples didn't steal the body? That can account for, what we're seeing there, right? Can't that account for it? Well, no, it can't actually. When you start looking at it, it may be able to account for something like the empty tomb. It assumes an empty tomb, right? If you're saying the disciples stole the body. By the way, that's what the Jewish leadership said. So they didn't deny the tomb was empty. They were just giving a different cause for its being empty. But if we say the disciples stole the body, okay, well, that creates some problems, because that only accounts for why the body's missing. It doesn't actually account for the group appearances that we're seeing, because in that information in 1 Corinthians 15, there's 3 group appearances and 3 individual appearances. So it doesn't account for those. It doesn't account for the appearance to Paul, because Paul probably thought the disciples stole the body too. So it doesn't account for his conversion. It doesn't account for him radically changing his views. He's probably thinking right along that they stole the body, especially if that's what the high priests were saying.
Right.
It doesn't account for James's conversion either. And nor does it account for the disciples' transformation and their willingness to suffer and die. There's some good sayings. Martyrs make poor myth makers, or liars make poor, liars make poor martyrs is another one.
Yeah.
So, and all we've done right there, we didn't go beyond really the minimal facts to explain those things. We just highlighted from the minimal facts. That's why I like them. It's a good foundation. It's a strong foundation. Obviously, you can unpack that at a black belt level at 1,054 pages, or you can do the case for the resurrection, which I read as an undergrad, barely knowing Paul wrote half the New Testament, and I was able to follow and track along with that.
Yeah, it's helpful. It just keep pointing back to those facts, because we have to figure out a way to, okay, sure, the disciples stole the body, or there might be something like they were just having a vision or a hallucination. Again, like there are ways, there's paths just pointing back to those facts. Like would they die for a hallucination? Would they? So That's helpful. Okay, I should stop talking about resurrection because I'm sure we're gonna. But
No,
I want to
I
hit
did
some
my
other things for
dissertation on the resurrection. It's a great topic.
So
And
what was your take? What did you do differently in your dissertation? Like,
that's such a good question because you empathize with the difficulty of working with Habermas, who studied
yeah,
it for 50 years, coming out with about 4,000 pages on the resurrection. What am I going to do that's any
yeah,
different?
exactly.
That's going to be, that's going to, make him go, wow,
That's right. That's right.
Not much is the short answer. No. So what I did was I tried to address, so because the challenges, and this skeptics recognize too, the challenge that the minimal facts has provided for alternative theories. One common response to say today is like, well, I don't know what happened, but I can tell you what didn't happen, and that's resurrection. And so I was like, okay, well, that doesn't seem right. What's going on here? And so I addressed 3 roadblocks to resurrection research. Why would people not want to study it? And the first one is, how do we know anything about the past? Because we're all biased, and that's that postmodern question that I had working itself out. We can know the past even if we're biased, and we give I give some examples in there. People convert from one view to another all the time in all sorts of different areas. So evidence can change our views. Evidence can impose itself on us so long as we follow after it. The second topic was, well, then if we can, how do we know the past? And then I use the minimal facts as one method. I also talk about the historical criteria, which is a chapter in the book too, because we all use historical criteria every day without using it. And the criteria I'm referring to here are authenticity or historicity. And so I just unpack those a little bit, and we'll probably talk about that in the book section. And then the third one is on, can a historian recognize a miracle? And I think that they can. A lot say they can't because they'll say, well, if you believe in a miracle, that's just faith. Well, I don't know how faith is an epistemology there. That's
sure.
And like, if I were to use that sort of language with my wife, hey, Ben, are you faithful to your wife? Like, oh, I just believe her because no, like being faithful to my wife is me. It involves a lot more than just like this mental assent to her. It involves me knowing her and then being faithful to that knowledge and acting accordingly. So it's not just faith. We talked about the Jewish scholars. Pinchas Lapid thought the resurrection happened, but he remained Jewish. So you can acknowledge the fact of an event while not being faithful to it. A lot of people know, who the king was during the French Revolution. They weren't faithful to him.
Sure.
So that's an example there. Or they'll say, well, you're not doing history anymore, you're doing theology. But historians cross-discipline all the time. If they write on the Great Depression, they're doing economics. If they write about the French Revolution, they're doing politics and military. Like, are you telling me they can't talk about those things? That doesn't seem to make any sense. So we do it. And again, we all have the same access to the past. So it's not as though when I become a believer, I have this special access. I've just committed myself. That's the difference.
This is helpful. I mean, it basically, there's no basic to it, but it's assessing what is real. Like, how can we know? Can we know anything? And if we exist in a world where God has revealed himself, then we have a kind of foundation for us to understand that we can say this happened. This is a reality. So it seems like I'm interested in that approach. I'm really glad you did that.
That was very encouraging for me because I said when I came to Liberty, I was struggling with some of those things. And just as you said, well, if you're a believer, how do you know about this? How do you know about this? Now the question gets kind of flipped. Well, if you know the resurrection happened, you have to account for that in your reality now. So it shouldn't just move us to continue to ask, well, what if, what if, what if? It should ask, what now? That it happened. And that's the Acts 17, 30, and 31. That Jesus is going to return as judge. He's going to hold us accountable. We know this because he's proved it through the resurrection. So now I'm going to be accountable for my actions. And so what am I going to do with those things? And Ephesians 2:10 is, well, I'm created for good works, that I should be walking in them. God's prepared specific ones for me, for you, for listeners, that each of us are talented and gifted to do, but we need to be faithful to do them. And then actually at the end of 1 Corinthians 15:58, be steadfast in good works, for they're not in vain. So we know that the things we do have eternal significance. That was very important for me, because postmodernism typically leads towards nihilism and meaninglessness. And so this was just very powerful for me, and then I would remember it and recall it, like you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, I've had Jay Warner Wallace on the podcast a couple of times. I'm going to have him come on here soon again as well. He was the first person I heard say, like, how do you spell evangelism in our time? And he spelled apologetics. And but it's interesting. I like the emphasis you have in saying this is also discipleship. And
Yeah,
this was
yeah,
your experience as well. That okay, discipleship isn't just the things we do in a small group, but it's us coming to a firmer understanding of the faith once for all delivered to the saints.
yeah.
Tell us more about that. Like
Let me
that's
let
certainly
me
an
let
approach
me
that you
just do.
take.
Yeah, let me put to you this way. This is a question I've asked a lot lately. Is knowing that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15 an apologetic question or a discipleship question?
Yeah. Yes. The
Yes,
answer is yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's
exactly.
not either or,
And
right? Yeah.
that's right, because you have to have you don't have zeal without knowledge. And oftentimes people think apologetics is just knowledge, but knowledge alone puffs up. We're not called to just be these mental robots, but it's a holistic aspect to it.
Yes.
And I'll go
Yes.
back to my wife for a second. I married a girl from the South. I learned about SEC
Me too.
football.
Me
So,
too.
that's right. She asked me who my favorite college football team was. I was like, Miami, because my mom went there, and she laughed. She's like, it's not even the SEC. I said, who's your favorite college football team? So she's Auburn. Should note,
Okay.
the founder of Core, he's Alabama. His dad played for Bear Bryant. So,
Oh,
you know,
wow.
we
Okay.
got some tension there. But if I have love for her and I want to be faithful to her and I buy her an Alabama jersey, she's going to kick me in the head hard,
Yeah.
quite
Yeah.
hard, right? Because that's zeal without knowledge. But being faithful to her involves me knowing things about her and knowing what's pleasing to her. An Auburn jersey is going to be pleasing to her,
That's
not
right.
an Alabama jersey. So, how much more now when it comes to the things of God? And so, again, if we're going to give a reason for the hope that we have to understand and know that hope. So that's part of the discipleship. And then that equates to apologetics, and that equates to evangelism, and that equates to our daily lives too.
Yeah. I love that. You talk about the South. Even, I was 19th year now in the South. Most of my adulthood has been in the South. And when I went to Florida, I realized people would say, if you want to go south, go north. Right. Miami doesn't count.
That's right.
That was
Yeah.
certainly the case. So
South of Orlando, different.
that's
Yeah.
right. It is a totally different social environment.
Yeah.
When you're talking back to this idea of like this being like the form of discipleship, it's interesting that when you go to even just acknowledge the reality of this hymn, some people are quick to abandon it because they think, oh, this is for the scholars. This is an academic discussion. But really, it's not this isn't just something for the preacher to have to give you some breadcrumbs. This is a part of understanding how God has revealed himself in space and time, how we understand basic facts of the universe. I mean, again, tell us, well, why do people need to study this, Ben? Why do they need to just let themselves go a little deeper?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Paul doesn't start his letters or put a little segue in there. Hey, this is just for the scribes and the lawyers. He doesn't have any comments like that. It's for the church, and so we're
Yes,
all a
yes.
part of the church. And so that's one of the things about core apologetics that I'm really passionate about, is because I felt like I had to go get a master's degree and a PhD to
Right.
get discipled. And I'm like, oh, it need not be this way. We
Yes.
talked about some people are called to the black belt 1,000 pages, right?
Yes.
Not everybody's called to that. We need godly businessmen. We need godly lawyers. We need godly people in medicine. We need them everywhere, and in every capacity. And that's what we're called to do. That's why he's equipped us all differently. I never would have thought I would have been in academia. If you saw my report cards, you never would have thought I would have been there. But he's got reasons and good works for us each to do with the talents he's given us. But we want to do them grounded in God's kingdom and being faithful to him as Lord. But in order to do that, we got to know about his kingdom, and we got to know what's pleasing to him, and then continually remind ourselves of those things, because trials, tribulations, and temptations are going to come. And if we're not prepared beforehand, it's a lot harder to stand if you don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is foundational for standing in this time. Okay, I haven't talked enough about the book. I'm sorry, folks. You're just going to have to go out and get it. Trustworthy. But I want to hit, I like this chapter on undesigned coincidences, that this being I love for you just to highlight that a little bit. All of this is like, and I would love to follow up too, like on some of the things that you said too about the use of secretaries being its own form of helping us understand its reliability. But I'm going to back. I want to talk about undesigned coincidences. Tell us why that's significant. In these unintentional things help us create a foundation for the trustworthiness of Scripture.
Yeah. So, and an undesigned coincidence, it's pretty interesting because they've kind of come back. They were studied a lot years ago, and then they've kind of fell by the wayside for some reason. But Lydia McGrew helped bring them back to our attention. And an undesigned coincidence is like two puzzle pieces that were made by two different people of taking a picture of the same event or the same scenery, and they fit together perfectly to illuminate or bring the picture together in a bigger way. And so an example may be helpful here to show what we mean. Because when two puzzle pieces come together and there's no evidence, like there's no reason to think that these two authors corroborated, they're coming together because they're both taking a picture of the same thing. They're not coming together because they corroborated together. And so an example of this is in John 6, in 1-7. This is the feeding of the 5,000. So it's right before that. And he asks Philip, where should we go to get food? But you're like, why is he asking Philip? Philip's not, a main character typically in the Gospels. Why Philip? And in John 1, you learn that Philip is from Bethsaida. So you're like, okay, what's that got to do with anything? Well, if you go to the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 9, he says that this feeding of the 5,000 takes place in Bethsaida. So Jesus is asking the hometown person, where do we go to get food around here? Because you're going to know. So if you if you were to go to, an area in Fort Lauderdale, and you're like, Ben, where's a good place to get food down here? Yeah. I'm not down there now, but I'll tell you, I know the different places. You're going to ask me. I'm not, we're not going to ask a stranger because they're not going to know, but you ask the hometown person. And so that's what we see here. It's the idea that John and Luke came together and conspired to make this little puzzle piece come together. It just sounds ridiculous. Yeah. Now you might go, well, that's just a minor puzzle piece though. Well, yeah, that's true. But if we have a number of these, which we do, then that adds a cumulative case. It also shows a habit or a consistency of faithful representation to the past, which is also another indicator of trustworthiness. What's also interesting is we also have accounts from inside the New Testament and outside the New Testament that highlight one another. So Tacitus and Luke also come together to illustrate why there may be multiple proconsuls. And I think it's Ephesus, when everyone knows there's only one proconsul. Why is he saying multiple here? But this happened to be a time when that proconsul was just executed. So there's multiple people in charge right now.
Yeah, I love.
Yeah, those are the undesigned coincidences. They're a great puzzle. They're a great another angle of New Testament reliability that we shouldn't be ignoring. They're very helpful. They help give greater depth and appreciation to Scripture. So,
yeah, I think that's really helpful because one thing that can happen is like acknowledging it within Scripture. But I loved your chapters too on non-Christian, non-canonical sources as well, of how they can verify and help us see that there is something reliable in what we have. Back though to this idea of having these undesigned coincidences, like in that case, the John 6 case, well, if it was one picture, somebody's taking one picture of it, that you might say, okay, well, Thomas or Philip, because he was from there, did this, but you're finding that data somewhere else and bringing it in. I think that's helpful. Like, I just might not fit into it, but I've been thinking a lot about Jude lately, and thinking about Judas being the brother of Jesus. And and this is the same thing with James. Like, it's just interesting to me that of the common language, and actually I've seen an academic article on this just recently, common language that they have that's similar to Jesus's, like "woe to you," like these various other phrases, and even finding similar sources in that from the region of Nazareth, what they might have emphasized. So I think these are undesigned. Would that fit in with what you're saying, Ben?
I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's another good argument. I'm like one of those guys. This is the jujitsu in me. I want as many moves as I can have because I never know what the situation is going to call for. I know there's a number of different types of of those undesigned coincidences. And there's different levels to them too. So that may fall well within them. Lydia McGrew's talked about them. Peter, I'm going to forget his last name. There's a lot of Peters out there, but oh my goodness.
Kreeft?
No,
No,
not
no,
Kreeft.
no,
I think he's
no.
European scholar. But anyway, he talks about them in his book. Oh, it drives me crazy. I can't think about it. But the books from the 1800s have talked about them too. Of course, those scholars are now escaped. Once you lose one, you start losing them all.
Yeah, sure. I got you. No problem.
Yeah.
There's somebody talks about the circle of truth. I've heard that argument too in the past. Now I'm drawing a blank. Okay. That's a sign to move on to something else. So Ben, I'm curious, like in your own experience, what's the reliability question that's the hardest for you? Like, what's been the thing that for you to work through that's like, man, I'm working through this, or or writing this book kind of helped me get to a better answer. And I because I think it's helpful too to acknowledge, like, somebody who's in an apologetics ministry, that we have to, there are questions that are difficult, hard ones, but it's worth fighting through. And maybe I give you this question because I think it'd be helpful for people to realize you're working through some of these difficult historical questions too.
Yeah. So I think for me, one of the things that was helpful for me is because I use the term trustworthy or reliability in the book very broadly. I think really and it was intentional. It was intentionally done that way. And I think now I can articulate and be more explicit as to why that is prior to when I was starting. Because reliability, it comes at different levels. We just talked about it at undesigned coincidences. That's one level. But textual criticism, that's an entirely different level. But you need both of those together. So saying it's reliable textual critic perspective is totally different from saying it's reliable from undesigned coincidences perspective. But you bring those together, and that adds to this big case of trustworthiness. It's not one act that makes someone trustworthy; it's multiple acts. Same thing here. To use a hockey analogy, oh, Ben, you played college hockey, you must be good. Oh yeah, I guess so. Well, yeah, you should go play with Tampa Bay Lightning sometime. Well, wait.
Yeah.
Totally different word here. Okay, that's not good on the same level. So you're not good at hockey. Well, no, I still am good, but not like that good. And so there's levels. So I'm trying to unpack those different levels. That's helpful for someone who has questions. That's helpful for a disciple who had questions like I did, where I was just, I wanted to know more about scripture. But I also try to keep it brief, because if I show you every move, that's just going to overwhelm you, if that makes sense. And so here's the introduction to, the goal was that here's the introduction to all these different arguments. These are key questions you've probably asked. Here's the takeaway. Trying to be very concise, like 10 pages a chapter. That's part of the goals. Not 1,000 pages. There's times and places for that. I've got that. Craig Blomberg has a really great but big reliability book as well. But what's something for someone to get in and start understanding what are the different levels? Because each of the chapters is a dissertation, is a field of study in and of itself. Right.
So how do we sentences are?
Yeah. And I'm just trying to, how do I synthesize this just to, the key takeaways? And then if God calls some people to academia, to seminary, to school, now you can start to oh, I didn't know this was out here. I'm going to start studying these things. So that's one element where I felt better afterwards. There's other positives about the short book that I think are important for people who aren't planning to go to seminary. For example, business owners speak to 10 times more non-believers and non-Christians than pastors do. So we want them to be equipped with some of these things. But and then some of the questions, I think I say that in the 13th chapter, on the minimal facts chapter, because, hey, look, what if I'm wrong on all these things? Well, we still have the minimal facts. I don't talk about objections like contradictions or alleged contradictions and things like that. I refer to books on those subjects. And, there's on some texts, there's different interpretations you could take on different subjects, and some are easier than others, some are harder than others. So I cite some books you could take a look at for that, and I still use those. That's why I cite them. Two totally different approaches, but they can be complementary. But Norm Geisler and Dr. Howe have a book, The Big Book of Bible Difficulties. And it is a big book. It's a big book, but I've used that a number of times, just going, oh, I wonder what these guys do with this, or how do they,
Yeah, interesting.
understand this? So
Was there one
that's a
in
good
your
one.
own discipleship journey that is prominent? One challenge that you work through that?
Mine was more in the postmodernism side of things,
Gotcha.
more
Just understanding
philosophical
truth.
at the time.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that was the bigger hurdle for me. And then as I came across philosophers saying, well, truth doesn't exist. If God doesn't exist, there's no truth. And I'm like, well,
Yeah. Is that
truth's sort
true?
of
Yeah.
undeniable.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but
That's
yeah, so
interesting.
that's for me. There's the New Testament ones, there's issues I may wrestle with, but I'm pretty good on Deuteronomy 29. There's some things that belong to the Lord and he's going to know them. And
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
some things he's revealed for us. As long as I've got the core, that's what I need. That's what I can rest in. We'll get the other answers solved later on. So
Well, Ben, I think I had over 200 guests now on my podcast, and generally I ask this question. My podcast is called More to the Story, and I ask people, well, is there more to the story of Ben? But you, of all my guests, probably are the one who's already given us more. I want people to tell about their hobbies, and sometimes people really struggle. I think I've had one or two say, no, I keep on writing these type of books. That's what I do. But we have jujitsu. We have, I don't know if I'm even saying it right there.
you,
We have that. And then you have hockey, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that or something else about your life. I'd love to hear more of the story. I mean, I asked this question in part because the emphasis at our school is like in the kind of Wesleyan soteriological perspective, we want to just move beyond just forgiveness. Like it's about the transformation and a renewal in the image of God. And we see that as a process of sanctification in our life, the work the Spirit wants to do. So I always think that there's more to the story than just forgiveness. But that's on the other side of it. I like to get something else from a little bit more personal for my guests. So what could we possibly get, Ben? More to this story
yeah,
from you.
yeah. Okay, I got a dumb one.
Okay, good.
So I am curious by nature too. I think that's part of my background. But yeah, we talked about jujitsu. We talked about hockey. I still like both of those. I like being outside of the world of academia too, because academics, we tend to get focused on navel gazing and talking about things that people don't talk about. We forget about concrete reality. Jiu-jitsu has helped keep me in concrete reality. At a full-time day job as an insurance adjuster, that helped keep me grounded.
Okay.
But now something totally unrelated to both of those. When COVID happened, everyone was at home a lot more often. And so we have kids. We're trying to think, okay, what are some things we could watch? And we started watching card tricks. And so I started picking up and trying to learn card tricks and different magic tricks and things like that. So I still get really nervous doing them, but I enjoy doing it. It's a lot of fun. It's really silly, but it's a good thing that I kind of picked up. If I can incorporate that now into some talks, that'd be a good angle to
Oh
add.
yeah,
But I just
sure.
hadn't had time to think about that or add it yet. But
Tell me about your
yeah,
kids. How your
yeah,
ages of your kids.
we got three kids, 7, 5, and 4. And
Okay.
so, yeah, uh, one of them, well, we're trying to get both of them in hockey in this coming up year, so we'll see if they like it. I didn't play hockey as a kid, so it's interesting for me trying to teach them. So they're doing that. They've they learned swimming this summer, so that was good. That was fun. I'm from Florida. Everyone learns to swim, and I was telling my wife, like, hey, they're getting swimming lessons. It's just something you have to do. So we got to teach them that this year. That was exciting. I'm a third generation only child, so
Oh,
having
interesting.
3 kids is like chaos.
Yeah, sure.
And so one of the best things, I'll say this now, so everyone, especially the pastors, and our church did a child rearing class, and we went to it all 3 times when we had all 3 kids. It was the best thing for us because it put my wife and I on the same page for understanding how to discipline and instruct our kids with love. And it was just one of the best things that we've done.
Awesome. Well, Ben, thanks for taking time. Thanks for this book and for the work you're doing at Core. I know you do some adjunct teaching around too. I'm glad that I got a chance to meet you here, but also thankful for the work you're doing for the church, for the discipleship, for helping people become stronger in their faith. So thanks for coming again to the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And if I could just add,
Oh, yeah.
with the book, we've got a class coming up that I'll be teaching live online through Core Apologetics.
Okay.
And that'll be in September. So we're going to spend 6 weeks. I'll be teaching it live online. We'll be going through about 2 chapters a week. It's 1 hour on Sunday nights. And then you go to our website, coreapologetics.com, for more information on that. But it's an hour, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A after each class, and it's good. If you miss it, we record it. So I just want to let you guys know that we'll be doing that. I think it's neat. I don't know too many authors we get to go take a class with them.
Yeah,
so we're trying to do some things different and unique. So
what's the website where they can find out about that?
Coreapologetics.com, and I should say CORE apologetics.com.
Thanks so much, Ben. Appreciate your time.